The Xylos did not conquer planets, they integrated them into a grand, flawless machine. To the rest of the Orion arm, they were known as the Swarm, not because they were a mindless hive of insects, but because their military precision resembled a singular, terrifying consciousness. Their warriors stood 8 feet tall, encased in bioreactive chitin and heavy kinetic armor that hissed with pneumatic pressure at every step. They had spent 3 centuries taming the hostile, radiation-swept sectors of the Outer Rim, earning a reputation for absolute, unyielding dominance. Every species that encountered them learned to fear the rhythmic stomp of their armored phalanxes. They were the apex force of the galaxy, built for war, sustained by duty, and utterly unbothered by the concept of mercy. Jonathan Vance, by contrast, looked like someone who had spent his morning trying to remember where he left his favorite coffee mug. As a senior diplomatic liaison for the United Earth Coalition, Jonathan had lived on the Xylos orbital staging ground, the Needle, for 2 long years. He understood them better than most, having spent countless hours studying their rigid psychological profiles and complex biological history. He knew that beneath their terrifying, multi-eyed visages and razor-sharp appendages lay a culture deeply obsessed with efficiency, structure, and a profound, hidden anxiety about their own long-term survival. The Xylos were a dying demographic, their birth rates had been plummeting for generations, making every new clutch of eggs incredibly precious, yet their brutal societal structure often sabotaged their own future before it even began. Jonathan's presence on the massive space station was mostly tolerated by the High Command as a harmless diplomatic curiosity. Humans were viewed by the Xylos as fragile, overly emotional creatures who lacked the structural rigidity and biological armor required to survive the harsh realities of the deep cosmos. He spent most of his days filing mundane bureaucratic reports, adjusting to the fluctuating artificial gravity of the foreign station, and wearing soft, faded heavy cotton lounge shirts and slip-on shoes. It was comfortable attire that the Xylos military elite viewed as a baffling, almost offensive lack of personal defense. To a warrior caste that wore armor even during sleep cycles, a human walking around in cotton trousers was an evolutionary joke. The uneasy routine of the station shattered when the deck plating beneath Jonathan's feet began to vibrate with a deep, rhythmic pulse. The klaxons did not wail with the chaotic alarms typical of human ships, instead, they emitted a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the metal flooring, a sound that made Jonathan's teeth ache and signaled a massive red alert. The blast doors to his office slid open with a violent hiss, and Commander Vraxton stepped into the room, his 4 primary eyes flashing a stern, troubled amber. The commander's heavy chest console flickered with urgent data streams, and his mandibles flared aggressively as he struggled to keep his vocal synthesizers steady. The border sector at Kalos has ruptured, Vraxton clicked, the heavy bass of his native tongue vibrating through the room. The vanguard fleet of our ancient adversary has bypassed our primary defensive perimeter. Every available warrior, including the inner ring reserves and the planetary defense squads, must deploy immediately to intercept the invasion force. The station's external defense grid is fully automated, but our internal biological imperatives cannot be left to machines. Jonathan stood up from his desk, carefully setting down his datapad as he processed the sheer scale of the emergency. He knew what a total Xylos mobilization meant, and more importantly, he knew what else was scheduled to happen on the station today. The hatching, Jonathan said softly, looking directly into the commander's primary eyes. The first cast eggs are supposed to break within the hour. The hatching, Vraxton confirmed, his heavy armored shoulders shifting as he paced the small room. 62 larvae of the first cast, the future tacticians, warlords, and supreme commanders of our entire species. They are hyperreactive to environmental stimuli, born with an instinctual hunting frenzy that requires absolute containment. Usually, a phalanx of 12 fully armored sentries maintains dominance over the nursery chamber, using high-frequency neural whips to physically suppress them until their minds stabilize. We have no sentries to spare. Every single warrior is boarding the dreadnoughts. If left unmonitored, their anxiety will turn inward, and they will cannibalize one another. Jonathan felt a familiar chill run down his spine as he listened to the warlord explain the situation. He knew the dark truth behind Xylos biology and the cruel traditions that governed their upbringing. Because they bred apex predators, their young were born into a state of hyperaggression and acute sensory overload. The traditional Xylos method was to break their spirit early through fear, pain, and overwhelming physical dominance. The cost of this brutal method, however, was devastating. Xylos hatcheries routinely suffered a 20% mortality rate from shock and stress alone during the first week of life. To the swarm, it was simply an acceptable statistical loss in the pursuit of creating hardened soldiers. To Jonathan, it was a horrific, unnecessary tragedy born of a fundamental misunderstanding of their own offspring. The coalition claimed humans possess an anomalous capacity for cross-species pacification and psychological endurance, Braxton stated, stepping closer until his towering 8-foot frame cast a massive shadow completely over the human. Prove it now, Liaison Vance. Guard the hatchery in our absence. If the larvae die, your diplomatic ties die with them, and our alliance is severed permanently. Jonathan looked down at his soft trousers, took a deep, steadying breath, and then looked back up at the towering warlord with an expression of calm determination. I'll do it, Commander. I will keep them alive. But I am going to do it my way, which means I have two non-negotiable conditions. First, you will turn off the automated neural whips in that chamber completely. Second, I need your logistics bay to deliver every single heavy-grade thermal blanket they have in storage to the nursery doors immediately. Braxton's mandibles flared wide in a gesture of profound, mocking skepticism, his vocal synthesizer clicking sharply. They will tear your soft, unarmored flesh to ribbons, human. You do not possess the strength to fight them. I don't plan on fighting them, Commander, Jonathan replied quietly, adjusting the sleeves of his cotton shirt. Let's just hope they are tired instead. The heavy, 4-inch thick blast doors of the Vanguard hatchery sealed behind Jonathan with a definitive, metallic thud that resonated through his entire chest. The sound was incredibly final, locking him inside a reinforced bunker that felt far more like a military prison than a nursery. The air inside the chamber was thick and suffocating, smelling heavily of ozone, damp subterranean earth, and a sharp, metallic pheromone that instantly made the hairs on Jonathan's arms stand on end. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing his racing pulse to slow down as he surveyed the environment. He was now entirely cut off from the rest of the station, left completely alone to face the volatile future of the galaxy's most feared military empire. In the center of the massive room lay a subterranean heat pit filled with deeply pulverized volcanic sand, which cast a dim, amber glow across the industrial walls. Dozens of translucent, leathery eggs, each one roughly the size of a human torso, were already shifting, pulsating, and rupturing under the intense heat. From the peeling, leathery hulls emerged the hatchlings of the Xylos' first caste. They were the size of large Terran hounds, covered in a soft, glistening, damp exoskeleton that had not yet hardened into their signature biological armor. They possessed rows of gleaming, needle-like teeth, multi-jointed legs that clicked frantically against the bare floor, and large, milky black eyes that frantically searched the shadows for incoming threats. A traditional Xylos warrior's immediate response to this sight would be a display of overwhelming, terrifying force. The sentries would stomp their heavy boots, let out guttural roars, and fire warning shots from their energy prods to forcefully assert dominance and cow the larvae into submission. Jonathan, however, did the exact opposite. He walked with a slow, unhurried pace toward the edge of the pit, carefully dragging the massive pile of heavy-grade thermal blankets that the logistics drones had dropped off just moments before the lockdown. He did not yell, he did not make sudden movements, and he did not show a single hint of aggression. Instead, he simply sat down directly on the cold, Durasteel floor, a few yards away from the chaotic edge of the volcanic sand. He pulled a massive, weighted thermal blanket completely over his lap, leaned his back flat against the gently vibrating bulkhead, and closed his eyes. He began to breathe deeply and rhythmically, mimicking the slow, steady pattern of human deep sleep, allowing his body to become entirely still. The sudden lack of noise in the room caused the hatchlings to freeze instantly. Their internal thermal sensors easily picked up his warm human heat signature, and their sensitive chemical receptors registered something entirely alien to their predatory biology, a complete, baffling lack of adrenaline. Jonathan wasn't radiating fear, and he wasn't radiating aggression. To a newborn species hardwired to react exclusively to threats, the human was an impossible statistical anomaly. He was just a warm, steady, harmless rock in a terrifyingly loud universe. "You're okay, little ones," Jonathan murmured into the quiet room, keeping his voice incredibly low, soft, and completely devoid of sharp consonants. "There are no hunters here. There is no need to fight." The sound of his voice caused a few of the closest hatchlings to hiss defensively, their multi-jointed legs twitching as they tested the air. A large larvae, its damp chitin a dark, iridescent green, began to crawl slowly out of the volcanic sand pit. It moved with a jerky, hesitant motion, its mandibles snapping loudly just inches from Jonathan's exposed knee as it tried to provoke a reaction. Jonathan didn't flinch, nor did he pull his leg away, knowing that any sudden movement would be interpreted as an invitation to strike. He kept his eyes half closed, remaining as still as a statue while the creature sniffed his cotton trousers, its sensitive antennae brushing against the soft fabric. Slowly, with agonizingly deliberate movements, Jonathan reached into the pocket of his lounge shirt and pulled out a small, palm-sized low-frequency hum emitter. It was a common, mundane device that human colonists used to soothe tinnitus or stave off isolation-induced anxiety during long deep space voyages. He clicked the power button, adjusting the dial until the device emitted a deep, resonant, and continuous purr. The frequency was perfectly calibrated to mimic the natural structural vibration of a stable planetary crust, a sound deeply rooted in the evolutionary comfort of any subterranean burrowing species. The iridescent green hatchling immediately tilted its triangular head, its large milky eyes focusing intently on the small plastic device in Jonathan's hand. The aggressive, rapid clicking of its legs began to slow down, transitioning from a frantic defensive posture into a curious, cautious stance. The creature took a step closer, the sharp edges of its claws scraping softly against the metal decking, its mandibles remaining open but no longer snapping in anger. Jonathan watched it through his eyelashes, a small, weary smile touching the corners of his mouth as he realized his theory was holding true. "That's it," Jonathan whispered, his breath a gentle puff of air in the chilly room. "Just a steady rhythm. The world isn't ending. You can rest." With a movement so slow it looked almost static, Jonathan unfolded a wide section of the thick, heavy thermal blanket resting on his lap. He did not throw it over the creature, knowing that would trigger a blind panic. Instead, he simply draped the heavy, insulated fabric over the hatchling's lower torso, leaving its head free. To a young Xylos, the heavy, deliberate weight of the blanket perfectly simulated the comforting, uniform pressure of being buried deep within a subterranean nest beneath a protective mother. At the same time, the specialized material instantly trapped their rapidly escaping body heat, creating a pocket of absolute warmth. The green hatchling let out a strange, low-clicking sound that Jonathan had never heard a Xylos make before, a sound that was remarkably close to a sigh of relief. Its heavy legs relaxed, collapsing beneath its weight as it sank comfortably onto the soft fabric, its body heat finally stabilizing. Seeing their nestmate find comfort, several other hatchlings began to peer over the edge of the sand pit, their curiosity piqued by the sudden cessation of conflict. One by one, the confused, hyperstimulated larvae began to crawl out of the cold sand, moving toward the strange, warm human sitting against the wall. The frantic, high-pitched chattering that had filled the nursery began to drop, slowly melting into a low, vibrating hum of collective safety. The peaceful atmosphere within the Vanguard hatchery held steady for the next several hours as Jonathan remained an anchor of calm. The air, once sharp with the bitter tang of stress pheromones, had mellowed into something deeply familiar to anyone who had ever raised a living creature. More than half of the 62 hatchlings had now crawled completely out of the sand pit, drawn by the steady, low-frequency purr of the hum emitter and the heavy, insulated warmth of the blankets. They lay grouped together in a loose semicircle around Jonathan's legs, their multi-jointed bodies rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic pattern. The iridescent green hatchling had claimed the prime spot directly against Jonathan's left knee, its triangular head resting heavily on a fold of wool while its long antennae twitched lazily in its sleep. Jonathan watched them with a quiet, careful intensity, making sure his own movements remained entirely predictable and soft. Every few minutes, a new hatchling would wake up, stretch its damp legs, and let out a small, exploratory hiss. Whenever this happened, Jonathan would gently guide another section of a thermal blanket over the creature, whispering soft, meaningless words of encouragement until it settled back down. It was a tedious, exhausting process that required his absolute, unblinking focus, but it was working beautifully. The traditional Xylos method of breaking the young through fear began to look more and more like a tragic mistake with every passing minute of silence. He was proving that even the most feared apex predators in the galaxy didn't want to fight from the moment they were born, they just wanted to feel safe. "You see that, big guy?" Jonathan murmured softly, looking down at the green hatchling resting against his leg. No neural whips, no shouting, no stamping. Just a little bit of warmth and a quiet room. "You're not weapons yet. You're just babies who need a place to sleep." The green hatchling didn't wake up, but its mandibles clicked together once in what seemed like an instinctual response to the low rumble of Jonathan's voice. The sheer trust being displayed by these notoriously aggressive creatures was staggering. In any other circumstance, a human sitting unarmed among Xylos larvae would be considered suicidal by the United Earth Coalition High Command. Yet, here he was, completely uninjured, acting as a surrogate guardian to the future warlords of an interstellar empire. He allowed himself a brief moment to relax, leaning his head back against the cold durasteel wall, believing that the hardest part of the long assignment was finally behind him. That fragile illusion of safety shattered in a single, terrifying second. Without warning, a violent, bone-rattling shudder tore through the entire structure of the orbital station, throwing Jonathan forward and scattering several sleeping hatchlings. The ambient lighting overhead instantly died, plunging the massive hatchery into pitch-black darkness for 3 agonizing heartbeats before the automated emergency systems kicked in. A harsh, blood-red warning light began to flare from the ceiling fixtures, casting a sinister, rhythmic glow across the industrial room. At the same exact moment, the deep, mechanical hum of the subterranean heating grids beneath the volcanic sand pit groaned, sputtered, and completely died as a secondary power conduit failed across the sector. "Oh, no," Jonathan whispered, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as the ambient temperature in the reinforced room began to plummet instantly. "Not now. Please, not now." The sudden, catastrophic change triggered an immediate, evolutionary panic within the newborn Xylos. To their ancient, instinctual brains, the sudden darkness, the flashing red lights, and the encroaching, biting cold could only mean one thing: a lethal winter or an active attack on the nest. The peaceful, vibrating hum that had filled the nursery vanished, replaced instantly by a chorus of high-pitched, deafening shrieks. The hatchlings scrambled wildly over one another, their soft exoskeletons tense and trembling as they looked for the threat. Their milky black eyes rolled back, and their rows of needle-like teeth snapped aggressively at the empty air as their survival instincts completely took over. The large green hatchling that had been sleeping so peacefully against Jonathan's knee whipped its head around in a blind, terrified frenzy. Before Jonathan could react, the creature lashed out with its multi-jointed front leg, its sharp, unhardened claw slicing a clean, deep line straight across Jonathan's exposed right forearm. The pain was immediate and burning, a sharp jolt that made Jonathan gasp out loud as bright, warm human blood instantly welled through the torn fabric of his cotton lounge shirt. The smell of fresh copper and warm blood hit the air, sending the surrounding larvae into an even deeper, more frantic state of confusion and hyperaggression. "Stay down!" Jonathan barked, his voice straining to remain a low, authoritative rumble rather than a scream of panic as he clutched his bleeding arm. "It's just the cold. Don't run. I've got you." He knew with absolute certainty that if he panicked, if he stood up and ran for the heavy blast doors to save himself, the room would turn into a horrific slaughterhouse within minutes. The terrifying larvae would turn on each other in their desperation to find warmth and safety, cannibalizing the weaker members of the clutch exactly as Commander Vraxton had predicted. Jonathan took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing his own skyrocketing adrenaline down by sheer force of will. He couldn't act like a prey animal, and he couldn't act like a hunter. He had to be the parent. He had to be the shield that protected them from the freezing darkness, no matter the personal cost. Ignoring the throbbing pain in his forearm, Jonathan reached out with his uninjured hand and began forcefully dragging the remaining pile of heavy-grade thermal blankets directly into the center of the freezing volcanic sand pit. The larvae were swarming now, a chaotic mass of clicking claws, snapping jaws, and terrified shrieks as the cold began to stiffen their joints. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He deliberately threw his own body straight into the center of the frantic, writhing huddle, using his own physical mass as a human barrier. Humans were endothermic creatures, living, breathing, self-heating furnaces that radiated a steady, predictable 98 degrees of heat. In a freezing metal room, his soft, fragile body was the most valuable source of warmth on the entire station. He pulled the heavy, thick blankets completely over his head and body, creating a massive, insulated tent right in the middle of the pit. He reached out into the dark, blindly grabbing the snapping, terrified hatchlings and pulling them forcefully against his chest, his stomach, and his thighs. A sharp jaw nipped hard at his shoulder, and another claw scraped a painful line across his thigh, but Jonathan refused to back away. He held his ground, anchoring his weight against the cold sand, and wrapped the thick fabrics tightly around himself and as many shivering larvae as his arms could possibly hold. He became a living wall of human warmth, offering them the only sanctuary left in the dark. Beneath the heavy, insulated canopy of the thermal blankets, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, terrifying flashes of red emergency light bleeding through the edges of the heavy fabric. Jonathan squeezed his eyes shut, his teeth grinding together as another small claw nipped aggressively at his ribs, tearing a small hole in his cotton trousers. The physical pain was sharp and constant, but he forced his muscles to remain completely relaxed, refusing to tighten up or pull away from the frightened creatures. He knew that any sudden, defensive jerk of his body would be interpreted by the hyperreactive larvae as a counterattack, a mistake that would instantly shatter the fragile trust he had spent the last several hours building. "I've got you," Jonathan strained to say, his voice a tight, raspy whisper that barely carried over the sounds of their frantic clicking and shuffling. "Hold on. Just breathe. The heat is coming back, I promise you. Just stay close to me." He actively concentrated on his own breathing, expanding his chest in long, exaggerated movements to give the hatchlings packed tightly against his torso a steady, physical rhythm to sync up with. The scent of his own blood from his torn forearm was incredibly strong in the confined space, but to his profound relief, the larvae weren't attacking the wound. Instead, the large iridescent green hatchling had wedged its entire body beneath Jonathan's bleeding arm, pressing its cold, trembling carapace directly against the warmth of his inner elbow. The creature let out a sequence of sharp, panicked clicks, its smaller legs twitching rapidly as it fought the paralyzing effects of the ambient chill. Jonathan slowly moved his uninjured left arm, carefully sweeping it through the darkness to gather two more shivering hatchlings that were crying out near his hip, dragging them deeper into the core of his makeshift tent. As he packed them tightly against his stomach, the specialized layers of the high-grade military blankets began to do their job, catching and trapping the immense amount of body heat radiating from his skin. The cold air trying to seep through from the frozen floor was pushed back, replaced by a dense, stifling pocket of pure, trapped warmth. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the frantic, trembling movements of the larvae pinned against his chest began to quiet down. To reinforce the growing sense of safety, Jonathan began to hum a low, repetitive human melody, choosing an old, wordless folk tune that possessed a steady, undulating cadence. He matched the pitch perfectly to the low-frequency hum emitter that was still purring away somewhere near his feet, creating a dual-layered wall of soothing sound. In the pitch-black space, the combination of his deep vocal vibrations and the concentrated endothermic heat began to work a small miracle on the alien predators. The terrifying, defensive shrieks that had echoed through the nursery just minutes prior began to fade, replaced by small, questioning chirps. "That's it," Jonathan murmured between verses of the song, his lips brushing against the soft, damp exoskeleton of a hatchling resting right beneath his chin. "You're safe in the nest now. The winter can't reach you in here. Just listen to the sound and let your armor rest." A few of the more aggressive larvae on the outer edges of the huddle attempted to break away, their instincts telling them to hunt for the source of the cold, but Jonathan firmly but gently adjusted the heavy fabric, tucking them back into the group. He used his own legs to pin the loose corners of the blankets down against the volcanic sand, sealing off any gaps that might allow the freezing air to spoil the microclimate he had created. His shoulders ached from the awkward posture, and his bleeding arm throbbed with a dull, white-hot intensity, but he did not shift his weight a single inch. He was entirely committed to being their anchor in the storm. By the end of the second hour, the air inside the blanket tent had become incredibly warm and thick, smelling intensely of the sweet, musky pheromone that signified a settled, non-aggressive xylose clutch. The sharp, metallic scent of their fear had completely dissipated, neutralized by the overwhelming presence of the humans' calm biology. The 62 hatchlings were no longer a chaotic mass of snapping jaws and thrashing limbs, they had formed a tight, interconnected mound of sleeping bodies, completely relying on Jonathan as their central heat source. Even the large green hatchling had stopped its defensive clicking, its mandibles resting entirely closed against the fabric of Jonathan's torn shirt as it drifted off into a deep, evolutionary slumber. Jonathan let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief, his head sinking back against a pile of sand as the profound exhaustion of the ordeal finally began to take its toll on his mind. He looked through a small gap in the blankets, watching the red emergency lights continue to flash silently on the ceiling of the dark room, a grim reminder that the station was still operating on emergency reserves. He knew the external battle for the sector was likely still raging out in the cold void of space, with Commander Vraxton and his warriors fighting for the survival of their species. But down here, in the dark, a different kind of battle had been fought and won, not with plasma or kinetic iron, but with patience, blankets, and a refusal to meet fear with violence. "Sleep well, little warlords," Jonathan whispered into the dark, his eyelids growing heavy as the warmth of the huddle enveloped him like a thick cocoon. "Your parents are taming the stars out there. The least I can do is keep your world warm until they get back." He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing down until it perfectly matched the collective, deep hum of the 62 alien hatchlings sleeping soundly all around him. He was covered in minor cuts, his clothing was ruined, and he was completely trapped beneath a mountain of apex predators, but for the first time all day, Jonathan felt a profound sense of absolute peace. He allowed himself to drift off, trusting the very creatures the galaxy feared to keep him safe through the remainder of the long, silent night. The silent hours of the orbital night crawled by in a slow, heavy haze of warmth and exhaustion. Deep within his self-made cocoon, Jonathan drifted in and out of a restless sleep, acutely aware of every minor movement within the heavy pile of blankets. The biting chill of the room remained constant outside their fortress of wool, but beneath the layers, the collective metabolism of 62 hatchlings had fully stabilized. They had woven themselves into a dense, interlocking puzzle of limbs and tails, using Jonathan as the living foundation of their nest. Every time the station hummed or shuddered from a distant mechanical adjustment, the large green hatchling would press its smooth head tighter against Jonathan's chest, letting out a soft, trusting click before settling back into a deep slumber. Jonathan carefully adjusted his left leg, which had gone entirely numb under the weight of 3 closely huddled larvae. He winced silently as the movement pulled at the dried blood on his right forearm, but the pain was manageable now, dulled by the sheer exhaustion that consumed his entire body. He looked out through a narrow seam in the blankets, watching the oppressive, blood-red emergency lights continue their rhythmic, silent pulsing across the ceiling. There was no clock in the pitch-black core of the nest, but his own biological rhythm told him that many hours had passed since Commander Vraxton and the fleet had jumped into the warzone. The absolute silence from the rest of the station was deafening, leaving Jonathan completely alone with his thoughts and his young charges. "Still with me, aren't you?" Jonathan whispered into the dark, his voice barely a breath of air against the soft exoskeleton of the hatchling resting beneath his chin. "You guys are a lot better at sleeping through a crisis than we are. I guess when you're built to inherit an empire, a little bit of dark doesn't scare you as much." The creature didn't wake, but its long, delicate antennae swept lazily across Jonathan's cheek, leaving a faint, damp trail that tingled against his skin. It was an incredibly surreal experience for a human diplomat who had spent years handling rigid, terrifying alien warlords who refused to show even a single shred of vulnerability. Out in the corridors of the station, the Xylos were beings of absolute iron and unyielding pride, hiding their emotions behind thick armor and booming vocal synthesizers. But down here, stripped of their culture's brutal expectations and the violent discipline of the neural whips, they were shockingly fragile, desperately seeking the exact same comfort and safety that any newborn creature on Earth would require. As the hours continued to stretch, the high-pitched emergency klaxons outside the nursery suddenly ceased their low-frequency vibration, and the harsh red light bathing the room abruptly cut out. A second later, the standard, brilliant white industrial lighting of the hatchery flickered back to life, flooding the room with a stark radiance that seeped aggressively through the gaps in the thermal blankets. At the same exact moment, the deep, mechanical rumble of the subterranean heating grids beneath the volcanic sand pit groaned back to life, sending a wave of automated warmth rising through the floorboards. The main power grid of the station had finally been restored, signaling that the external crisis had passed and the engineering crews had retaken control of the primary systems. "The power is back," Jonathan muttered to himself, squinting against the sudden brightness that pierced through the wool fibers above his eyes. "That means they're coming home. Or whoever is left is coming home." The sudden change in light and ambient temperature caused a wave of restless movement to ripple through the sleeping pile of larvae. A few of the hatchlings on the outer perimeter began to uncoil their multi-jointed legs, blinking their large, milky black eyes as they adjusted to the warmth of the room. The large green hatchling against Jonathan's chest stirred slowly, its mandibles opening in a wide, clicking yawn that revealed rows of sharp, needle-like teeth that were already beginning to harden in the open air. It didn't lash out or hiss defensively this time. Instead, it simply rolled onto its side, resting its heavy front appendage casually over Jonathan's waist as if it had no intention of leaving the comfort of the human side. Jonathan smiled wearily, his hand carefully moving to pat the creature's smooth, iridescent shoulder with a gentle, rhythmic patting motion that he had used on Terran animals back home. "Good morning, little commander. You survived the night. See? I told you the warmth would come back if you just stayed put." The hatchling let out a sequence of low, rhythmic chirps that sounded remarkably content, its body relaxing completely under the heavy fabric of the blanket. For the next hour, Jonathan remained exactly where he was, refusing to dismantle the nest until he was absolutely certain the larvae were fully awake and stable. He watched them stretch, preen their new chitin, and interact with one another with an unprecedented lack of aggression, their usual instinctual hunting frenzies completely bypassed by the profound sense of security they had experienced during the cold crisis. They had learned to associate the presence of the human, and the sound of his low, humming voice, with absolute safety, creating a psychological bond that no traditional Xylos upbringing could ever replicate. A sudden, heavy mechanical groan echoed from the far side of the room, followed by the deep, pressurized hiss of the primary 4-inch-thick blast doors unlocking. Jonathan braced himself, his muscles tensing slightly as the heavy metal barriers began to slowly slide open, breaking the isolation that had kept him protected from the harsh reality of the galaxy for the last 12 hours. He knew that whatever stepped through those doors would change everything, bringing an end to the quiet sanctuary he had built in the dark. He kept his arms wrapped loosely around the closest hatchlings, refusing to move, waiting calmly to see if he would be greeted by a victorious ally or the grim reality of a fallen station. The heavy blast doors finally slid completely into the bulkheads with a massive, pressurized hiss, breaking the absolute isolation of the nursery. Commander Vraxton stepped heavily into the hatchery, his massive 8-foot frame unyielding, but his bioreactive battle armor was heavily scorched, dented, and leaking lines of pale blue coolant from the brutal frontier skirmish. Behind him stood a full phalanx of 12 elite sentries, their heavy kinetic rifles raised and their high-frequency neural whips humming with a threatening, electric energy as they prepared to reclaim a volatile warzone. They had rushed straight from the docks, fully expecting to find a scene of horrific devastation, a chaotic bloodbath of cannibalized larvae, or at the very least, a failed human post. Vraxton stopped dead in his tracks, his massive armored boots freezing against the threshold as his 4 primary eyes dilated in absolute, unadulterated bewilderment. Behind him, the elite sentries raised their heavy weapons in sheer confusion, their sensors frantically scanning the room for threats before slowly, awkwardly lowering the barrels. The terrifying, chaotic shrieks they had expected to hear were entirely absent, replaced instead by a profound, heavy silence that felt completely sacred. The massive, reinforced nursery was entirely peaceful, bathed in the steady, warm white light of the restored station grid, holding no trace of the violent hunting frenzies that usually defined a Xylo's hatching cycle. The subterranean heat pit was completely unrecognizable, transformed from a harsh arena of jagged volcanic sand into a massive, undulating sea of soft, dark fabric. Wrapped incredibly tight within the heavy layers of the high-grade military thermal blankets, 62 apex predator larvae of the first caste were piled together in a single, massive, interconnected mound of sleeping bodies. Right in the absolute center of the pile, half buried under iridescent green carapaces, long twitching antennae, and heavy wool, was Jonathan Vance. His cotton shirt was entirely ruined, his trousers were torn, and dried human blood stained his right sleeve, but his slow, even breathing showed a man who was deeply, completely at peace. Liaison Vance, Vraxton clicked, his vocal synthesizer dropping to a low, trembling whisper that lacked its usual booming authority as he stepped closer to the edge of the pit. What is the meaning of this? Where are the defensive structures? Why are they not asserting dominance over one another? At the sudden sound of the commander's voice, the large green hatchling poked its triangular head out from beneath Jonathan's arm, its large milky black eyes focusing on the towering warlords. It looked directly at Commander Vraxton, let out a soft, clicking yawn that held absolutely no malice or fear, and then buried its head right back into the crook of the human's neck, seeking the steady, comforting beat of his heart. The other larvae within the pile merely stirred lazily, shifting their weight against Jonathan's legs and letting out low, rhythmic chirps of absolute contentment. They showed no desire to fight, no panic from the cold crisis, and absolutely no instinct to destroy their nestmates. Jonathan slowly opened his tired eyes, a faint, weary smile touching his lips as he carefully patted the green hatchling's shoulder to keep it calm. They don't need to assert dominance, Commander. They just needed to be warm. When the secondary power grid failed and the temperature dropped, they weren't trying to destroy the facility. They were just terrified of the winter. So, I gave them a nest, and I gave them a rhythm to listen to. Vraxton stepped down into the volcanic sand, his heavy armor hissing as he knelt beside the massive mound of blankets, his multi-eyed gaze moving from the sleeping larvae to the bleeding cuts on Jonathan's arm. You are injured, human. They struck you. By the laws of our blood, you should have broken their spirits with force to ensure your own survival. Why did you not call for the automated defense systems to suppress them? Because if I had met their fear with violence, you wouldn't have a future generation to lead your fleets, Jonathan said quietly, his voice raspy but steady as he gently shifted his weight. They didn't bite me out of hatred, Vraxton. They bit me because they were freezing and blind in the dark. If you break a child's spirit before it even learns how to breathe, you aren't raising warriors. You're just raising broken things that only know how to fear. I chose to show them that the universe isn't always trying to kill them. The elite sentries behind the commander stood entirely motionless, their neural whips going completely silent as they looked at the thriving, peaceful future of their entire species resting soundly around a single, unarmored human. For 3 centuries, the swarm had tamed the hostile stars with plasma, kinetic iron, and an unwavering commitment to absolute physical dominance, believing that fear was the only true currency of survival. Yet, looking at the pristine health of the 62 hatchlings, Vraxton realized that their traditional, brutal methods had cost them thousands of lives over the generations, sacrifices made in the name of a flawed philosophy. We have fought across 1,000 sectors, Vraxton stated, his vocal synthesizer emitting a deep, resonant tone of profound respect that Jonathan had never heard from a Xylos before. We have conquered the radiation storms of the Outer Rim, and we have broken the front lines of our ancient adversaries with absolute steel. But our victories have always been forged in blood, and our nurseries have always been places of sorrow and loss. Today, you have achieved a victory that our plasma could never claim, Liaison Vance. It's just a few blankets and a little bit of patience, Commander, Jonathan replied, carefully extricating his numb left leg from beneath a sleeping larva. You should try it sometime. It saves a lot of fabric, and it saves a lot of lives. Vraxton slowly reached out, his massive, armored hand hovering gently over the green hatchling before resting it softly against the wool blanket, mimicking the human's gentle touch. The United Earth Coalition claimed your species possessed an anomalous capacity for endurance, but we foolishly believed it meant physical violence. We were wrong. Your strength is far more dangerous, human. It changes the very nature of the predator. The commander turned to his elite phalanx, his mandates flashing a definitive, command green. Deactivate all neural whips on this station permanently. Disarm the automated suppression systems in every nursery sector. From this day forward, the future commanders of the Xylo's first caste will learn the language of the nest before they ever hold a rifle. Jonathan let out a long, exhausted breath, finally allowing his head to sink back against the volcanic sand as the elite sentries began to quietly move through the room, carefully delivering food supplements to the waking larvae. The green hatchling gave one final, satisfied click against Jonathan's shoulder before slowly uncoiling its legs to explore the room, its demeanor completely altered by a night of absolute safety. The swarm would continue to tame the stars with iron and discipline, but as Jonathan closed his eyes to finally get some real rest, he knew that the future of the galaxy would be just a little bit warmer.